Hello there, kia ora. I was trying to work out what to put into the Omnibus intro this week, then I realised I should probably thank Sinead Boucher. After all, I did 2 episodes this week on something that media theorists call agenda setting, where the media sets the agenda for public discourse. And then on Friday, after seeing some examples from across the media spectrum, Sinead Boucher just comes out and says, well, that's pretty much what we're doing when I stand up with these 18 quite interesting people and start telling Wellingtonians that, yeah, we're totally unbiased after printing this kind of crap. Who would have guessed? So it was a really informative, educational, timely response. But on top of that, there's also a whole bunch of other stuff going on, like Brooke Van Voices pushing that rabbit hole stuff and some Strawman arguments popping up on my feeds. So yeah, sit down and enjoy the Omnibus. Don't forget, like, share, subscribe, do all of those good things that make the algorithm think that this is a really popular page. Oh, also, November 7, if you are in Whangarei, come and join me for one of 2 talks that I'll be giving. It's the same talk twice at different times in different locations around why I, as a middle-aged white man, am not that scared of Te Tiriti or Waitangi, but there seem to be an awful lot of people out there who are. It's a wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey journey, which is hopefully really fascinating. Anyway, make sure you do all of those things and enjoy the rest of the Omnibus episode. Hello there, kia ora. Let's have a little chat about the strawman argument, because it's popping up a bit lately in our political discourse, and it can be both persuasive and problematic. And it's not the same as the strawman theory used by sovereign citizens. As a rule of thumb, you can ignore that, just like anything else to do with sovereign citizens. In its simplest terms, a strawman argument is a rhetorical device used to misrepresent a view that the arguer doesn't agree with. Person 1 asserts a position, person 2 argues against a superficially similar position. It happens across the political spectrum, and it's used because it helps rally support behind an ideal or a stance, and is most often seen as a way of creating a them versus us narrative in a succinct way to deliver a core message. But it lacks nuance and can be misleading. The strawman argument being presented is often easier to disseminate, so to the people whose confirmation bias supports that argument, they see anybody using that argument as victorious in debate. We tend to see more of them appear as well from politicians in highly polarized political environments, the areas where there are strong feelings on both sides of an argument. There's a few reasons for this, and most of them are actually rooted in the changing way we communicate and communicate with others. The way mass media tends to use simplified messaging to reach a broad audience is actually a really big one. Your headlines or your clickbait articles. Take this example about the shock of Health New Zealand spending $9,000 on canapes while the health department suffered. In reality, it was $9,000 for 300 guests over 3 days. That works out to be $10 a head per day, and if that's 3 meals a day, because it wasn't just canapes, well, then that's about the same as David Seymour's proposing for school lunch budgets. Doesn't seem quite so bad then. Ideological polarization is another when it's used as a tool to discredit opposing views. The growth of social media echo chambers and partisan media often see strawman arguments gain prominence within these environments. Like this one here from Hamilton City Councillor Jeff Taylor. The topic he's commenting on is a threat from ACT aimed at funding body Creative NZ because they gave poet Tusiata Avia a prize with $25,000. And ACT took issue with her work. The post also points out that no matter their views or anyone else's on Avia's work, as a crown entity, the government cannot legally dictate who the money goes to, and threatening to do so from a party that extols the virtues of free speech so vehemently is contradictory. The content of the post doesn't mention any of her works and doesn't pass judgment on said works, but the strawman argument here is that anyone who points out ACT's opposition and threats is endorsing racism, as long as it's racism that they agree with, which clearly ignores the complicated factors of how racism is defined and experienced, including societal power dynamics, cultural dominance, contextual elements, oppression types like discrimination, xenophobia, ethnocentrism, and systemic consequences within society. The rise of populism also relies on simplified narratives and strawman arguments to pit the people against the elite, since they often make the opposing view look out of touch and disconnected from reality. NZCPR, for example, use strawman arguments around elite Māori trying to take over local and central government. Instead of looking at the nuance around nearly 200 years of disparity in treatment, the ongoing impacts of colonial history that include dehumanizing the indigenous population, stealing from them, vilifying them, and forcing assimilation on them, while hero worship for the colonists, the views from learned experts in constitutional topics and tikanga Māori and electoral outcomes and democracy. The strawman argument is a tool that often crops up in New Zealand around specific topics, like the End of Life Choices Bill or our tax system. John Key was accused of it in 2010 when opponents to his tax cuts pointed out that they would disproportionately benefit the wealthy, and he claimed opposition was actually really against wealth creation and success. In 2019, Simon Bridges used a debate around capital gains tax to claim that Labour wanted to punish families and small business owners. David Seymour's often claimed that opposition tax policies were designed to punish the rich and drive away successful people. Judith Collins claimed in 2020 that discussions around a wealth tax was an outright attack on homeowners. And last week, when asked about a capital gains tax, Prime Minister Christopher Luxon made claims that no one wants to see a CGT on KiwiSaver. When asked if his sale of 3 rental properties, which netted him untaxed capital gains, means we should look at a CGT. The reality is, though, that tax systems and discussions around them need nuance to be fully understood. They can be incredibly complicated and impact a range of people differently. And there are no political parties out there trying to punish success. Keeping our tax systems simple has led to problems around ways to ensure revenue for both local and central governance, and compared to international systems is lagging behind in many ways, like the ongoing exclusion of a capital gains tax. While most of the examples I've given are from right-wing political figures, it should be reiterated that strawman arguments get used a lot by the entire political spectrum, and our susceptibility to them often goes hand in hand with our own political bias. But more importantly than that, it shows that arguing over large, complicated, nuanced issues that our politicians need to do can't always be summed up in a soundbite or headline. But it's also that clear communication is a skill our political leaders need to highlight issues, that we as a public should be aware of the bigger picture and nuance to make sure strawman fallacies don't replace actual political discourse. Hello there, kia ora. Did you know there's only so much news we can handle dealing with? And it leads to a problem known as agenda setting in the media, which leads to bigger problems about what people are kept informed about. And even then, the way we interact with media has a side effect of setting agendas in the media. And that's part of the reason why you'll have seen headlines splashed all over the news on Tuesday about Wellington City Council, and not so much about Andrew Bailey and calls for him to resign, or Nicole McKee and her plans to tighten the disproven 3 strikes laws that they're reinstating, or Casey Costello and the fact the Auditor General is looking into her tax plan on heated tobacco products that the Prime Minister was unaware of. Oh, and there are some nefarious figures out there more than willing to manipulate these issues to get what they want. So let's start at the beginning. In media analysis, we have a term called the agenda setting theory. It posits that by choosing what to platform, what makes headlines, media sets the agenda for the general public on what it should think of as important. Research has shown that when pressed about what issues are seen as important by the public, stories which have been making recent headlines in social media rounds are the ones most commonly chosen. It's not to say that they're not important, but there is a correlation there between how much people see and how important they think of it is. So then why is the happenings within one city council dominating headlines? There are 64 local authorities all over the country. There is tension in almost all of them as they do what they're elected to do. In fact, Simeon Brown even stated public disagreements and attacks on councillors was part of the reason for an observer. Like, that isn't a common thing all over the motu. Wellington's no different in that respect, so why does it dominate headlines? Well, it's a combination of agenda setting and something else known as the spiral of silence. The spiral of silence is a phenomenon that occurs when people who oppose the views that dominate headlines pull back from expressing their views. So it creates a false sense of what people view as important. Sometimes that can be deliberate as well, and Wellington City Council sits in the middle of a perfect storm between that spiral and that agenda. Within the council, there are councillors actively pushing a negative narrative who are ideologically in line with central government, but the minority in Wellington Council. Nicola Young, for example, has been going out of her way since last year to bring into question the leadership of Mayor Tory Whānau, beginning with malicious rumours on far-right media outlet The Platform about a video that a friend of a friend who just happens to be a really good Wellingtonian apparently saw. Over the past few weeks, she's been uncritically platformed by other right-leaning media, like in News Talk interviews. The first to release public comments, which lead the stories across media platforms, and then more usually centrist platforms like RNZ pick up on it. But even they sometimes uncritically put up her comments without any kind of correlation to what's going on. Those right-wing platforms have influence, though, over our current government. We've already seen examples in the past, like claims around ethnicity as an assessment tool for waiting list prioritisation, going from rage farming on News Talk ZB to official party policy in a matter of hours. This platforming of her views on an ever-increasing range of media drives questions from the media to MPs, who should have stayed quiet but now are all too happy to use over-the-top rhetoric like this because it drives headlines and keeps attention away from the things they don't really want you paying attention to. So, more people see the content, more people interact with it, and in this country, interaction and engagement levels on news increase when it frames a woman, particularly a wahine Māori, in a way that makes them seem like competent leaders, and not increase that engagement in a good way. Which means media companies want to ensure that continued engagement, so they keep pushing the same stories, which blows them out of proportion, but creates a sense for the public that they're issues which are more significant than they are because they are framing it to show right-wing commentary as more trustworthy than left-wing commentary. Hey look, see the use of the word claims here, for example, when juxtaposed with the word said here, brings into doubt for viewers what's actually happening. Well, that makes it harder for people to feel comfortable voicing opposing concerns because they feel outnumbered. The agenda has been set. Fascinatingly, though, we see in other areas without the influence of mainstream media but with a sense of community that there's strong public opinion against the actions that have led to this. Looking at Reddit as an example, the community there is firmly against right-wing councillors, especially Nicola Young, sharing stories of what they feel makes her actions problematic and media coverage of her comments that are also problematic. But these views aren't being platformed on mainstream media. They're not being seen by the likes of Simeon Brown, so they don't influence his choices. And all of this, the flurry of reactions, the need to drive engagement, the framing of the stories, it leads to decisions that minimize other issues because there's only so much an audience can actually handle before they disengage. So we hear about Wellington City Council disproportionately, while stories about mysterious IT problems that see emails vanish from parliamentarians' inboxes in the opposition and effective opposition actions like getting the Auditor General involved in Casey Casello's tobacco kickbacks get drowned out in the noise. The art of the distraction is something that happens in politics at every level, all over the world, and our shorter attention spans don't help. But neither do bad faith actors who go out of their way to sow discontent to get their own way when the voters didn't vote the way that those bad actors feel they should. Hello there, kia ora. On Wednesday, tens of thousands of protesters joined calls from a range of unions to come together in a protest against government cuts to, well, everything, except landlords and the menu at Bellamy's. A protest in the middle of a workday in the middle of the week is automatically going to make it harder for a lot of people to be there. But at locations all over the Mutu, people showed up. But if you were just following our mainstream media, well, you couldn't be blamed for thinking it hadn't gone ahead at all. Only one of our MSM outlets had live coverage on their page or a story covering the protest within an hour of it happening. 4,500 people filled the grounds outside of Parliament and it didn't really make much of a wave. Maybe, if they'd threatened to hang MPs and burnt the playground, it would be a different story. But this wasn't a protest to cause havoc or to threaten. It was to show the public who was impacted by the government budget cuts and decisions across a huge range of sectors that directly impact workers, like the cancellation of fair pay agreements, or the reinstatement of 90-day trials, or the refusal to support the anti-wage theft bill, and the smallest minimum wage increase ever, and those teeny tiny little tax cuts for the lowest wage earners. So why didn't this protest make waves in the media while our mainstream media kept sharing stories of Tory whānau's use of social media and how the North Island's going to lose an electorate due to population distribution, but which one won't actually be decided until 2025? Fingers crossed for botany. But, time will tell. The fact is, this is our media setting the agenda. Media has a lot of power in that regard. Agenda setting happens when media choose what to platform and what not to. Because of the reach of media, it creates a sense in the public of what's important and what isn't. Research has shown that when it comes to protests and how media cover them, well, there are a range of priorities that differ slightly from place to place, but generally, anything that challenges the status quo garners more attention than a protest to keep things the same. And here in Aotearoa, protests that are inherently around issues seen as Māori related tend to get a significant amount of more coverage than non-Māori related protests. Our more centrist media tend to focus on the importance of the issues in those protests to Māori, and our more right-wing media tends to focus on the disruption those protests create to people not at the protests. Research released last year actually showed the way that Māori are portrayed on various news sites in negative ways was actually a leading driver to why many Māori feel vilified and targeted by news media. The Wednesday protest was not about that. It was well organised, it was well attended, and it was controversy-free. It was essentially a giant union meeting of unions where they voted to send a message to the government. The government is seen as the one fighting the status quo by making decisions which impact workers across industries, and under the previous government, well, not perfect in their record, they did a hell of a lot better in ensuring workers' rights and helping them earn more than what we're seeing at the moment. And ultimately, the editorial choices for each media outlet rests within those organisations. They each have their own drivers for what makes headlines and what's considered newsworthy. Well, I would think that thousands of people fighting for better outcomes for our millions of workers and public servants is newsworthy, and what the Mayor of Wellington does on her own social media feeds isn't. I don't get to make that call. I don't get to set the agenda for public discourse on a topic. But the public can, by choosing how they interact with media on social platforms, what they share and what they give feedback on. Just because the media is setting the agenda, it doesn't actually mean that the public have to accept it. Hello there, kia ora. I sometimes wonder what planet some of our MPs are on. I mean, there's always some weird stuff that's coming through, like when Andy Foster tried to mansplain to a reporter that she should support New Zealand First's attempts to vilify trans people in amateur sports, or Nationals' Maureen Pugh claiming that she's been hit by lightning 3 times. But this week, we saw a new level of weird from Workplace Relations Minister Brooke Van Voices. When asked if she agreed that the current government was the most anti-worker government ever, well, she disagreed. And I mean, that part in itself isn't weird, and it's a fair question, and her answer is clearly a standard answer because the facts are completely inconsistent with it. After all, this is the government that canned fair pay agreements before they started, despite official advice that they'd have a huge benefit for Māori, Pacifica and young workers. This is the government that saw the smallest minimum wage increase ever, which was more than Brooke actually wanted to give people, or the tax quote-unquote relief for low-wage earners being barely a couple of dollars a week. This government's the one that reinstated 90-day trials for big business in a move that lawyers described as contrary to the intentions of the Employment Relations Act. Van Velden's the one who wants to change sick pay to an accrual system for part-time workers and rewrite health and safety regulations and the Holidays Act, which is also a bit of a worry considering she's also the one that said that when it came to COVID, we completely blew out the value of a life. She's the one pushing for law changes around contractors that seems to have been written specifically by Uber after they lost a high court bid to not be able to call drivers employees and treat them like employees. It was this government that stopped the wage subsidy scheme for some disabled people that saw their wages topped up to a minimum wage with no plan to change the laws that even make that travesty possible. So why then is her answer in the House this week so weird? Well, she followed it up with a rant about vaccine mandates using what seemed like Voices for Freedom talking points. Here, have a listen.
Mr. Speaker, no, I don't agree with that statement because I believe, in fact, the most anti-worker government we've seen in decades is the previous government. It was the previous government that ordered vaccine mandates for workers. Never before have we seen the rights of workers across this country be eroded so swiftly. Not only did this erode workers' freedom of choice and bodily autonomy, so many people were forced out of their jobs because the government refused to look at other options like rat tests. Rather than listen to those affected workers, the previous government pushed them to the margins of society. The previous government's legislative overreach led to ostracism and division that have hugely impacted our civil society and had a negative impact on the employment and earnings of Kiwi individuals.
The height of the pandemic response definitely had issues, for sure. Faith-based communities, for example, came across problems like how Muslim communities under level 4 restrictions had a lot of trouble accessing halal food. And all through the initial response, even before the vaccines were developed, the business interests that Van Velden listens to so fervently over workers were throwing their toys about how cruel and mean the old left-wing government was by not letting everyone just do what they want and let the strong survive, as long as they could still spend money. It doesn't seem to matter to them either that the News Hub Reid research poll in the May of 2020 said 91.6% of respondents felt measures were right, or in 2021 a spin-off poll found 79% of people approved the choices the government made. And in 2022, the Herald found 57% of respondents thought the COVID response had been well judged and appropriate. And in 2021, Talbot Mills found 79% of health workers, 72% of teachers, 71% of hospo workers, and 70% of supermarket staff supported mandates. And a Colmar poll for One News in November that year found 74% of the entire country supported workplace vaccination mandates, or that private business organisations actually created rules around vaccine mandates for their staff, and there were already fields like education and health that had mandates in place as part of their job. But what is really concerning here isn't that Brooke thinks this is what being unfriendly to workers looks like, keeping them alive and safe, and her government's actions aren't anti-worker. She can't see that at all. That's been telegraphed for years, to be honest. It's actually that she is the minister overseeing the second phase of the Royal Commission into the government COVID response, and is one of the few people who have seen the report on that first phase. And it comes at a really concerning time since the government's slashing funding into extremism research in the country. ACT tried really hard to bury claims that they were a party determined to appeal to conspiracy theorists in the lead up to the election, after losing half a dozen candidates because they didn't vet them properly. This sort of rant about vaccines when she should be concerned about the powers of workers uniting, well, it shows that they didn't bury those attitudes far enough. Hello there, kia ora, and welcome to this week's news. Te Pāti Māori co-leader Debbie Ngāwera Paka, seen here chilling on the couch, wondering genuinely how your day was, says that she is, quote, gutted, obviously fucked off, end quote, with a decision from Spanish company Blue Float Energy Limited, which has withdrawn its plan to set up an offshore wind farm off the coast of Taranaki, citing the planned offshore seabed mining being put through fast-track legislation as part of their reasoning. The wind farm itself would have produced enough energy to power 440,000 homes, or the combined number of dwellings in the Waikato and Wellington regions. In Wellington this week, the Office of Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet announced an end of funding to Whenua Taurikura Research Centre, New Zealand's flagship research centre looking at violent extremism, set up in the wake of the March 15 attacks. This comes weeks after the closure of the Disinformation Project and the closing of investigative journalism project Stuff Circuit, all of which had focused on links between the rise of disinformation and violent extremism risks in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Said David Seymour and Winston Peters, seen here agreeing that the tail should wag the dog, in one curiously very, very rare photo of the two of them in close proximity to each other. Good. Maybe they'll stop telling people voting for us is dangerous now and we can embolden more racism. Common sense in people. The Minister for Land Information, Chris Penk, seen here wondering if there's something spicy on the menu at Bellamy's, like white rice seasoned with salt, has been asked to make a call about returning the name Petone to its original Te Reo Māori name of Pito One. The New Zealand Geographic Board, which is in charge of place names, has made the recommendation after years of exhaustive research that showed early settlers started calling the area by a bastardised version of the original Pa site name. While the local council has voted to accept the change and the overwhelming majority of public feedback was in support of the idea, it's being seen as doing something supporting Te Reo Māori is clearly scaring the minister, who is yet to make a final decision, and there is no time frame as to when he may make the call, then be overridden by the leader of the ACT Party saying it's not to his liking, and then publicly saying he's chosen not to go ahead with it due to the expense of, updating signs and email signatures. Invercargill Mayor Nobby Clark, seen here showing how he likes to greet people, has threatened to stop contributions to local media outlets as a threat over reporting the costs of his 3 Code of Conduct complaints, which have cost the city more than $79,000. Citing the fact that he believes media just want to regurgitate that issue instead of looking at the positives of his tenure, he has told the Otago Daily Times, the Southland Express and Stuff by email he has been left no option. If only they'd been more like that top-notch What's On Invis outlet who publish racist Garrick Tremaine cartoons and let Nobby say whatever he likes on regular segments. On Thursday, nearly 30 flights scheduled to fly in and out of Wellington Airport were cancelled due to the extreme weather, which saw wind gusts of up to 140 km per hour and 350 homes lose power. While NIWA had in place an orange wind warning for the region, Wellington City Councillor Nicola Young, seen here discovering that poor people exist and can't just be banned, once again blamed Tory whānau in a press release that's been spread across all mainstream media that said the reason she believes climate change is real is because she clearly can control weather. That's an evil superpower all left-leaning politicians have, so this is clearly all her fault, so Simeon needs to step in and appoint me as a commissioner. Speaking of Wellington, Newstalk ZB senior political reporter Barry Soper, seen here looking for some friends, has come under fire for an opinion piece claiming all perceived issues in Wellington under both current Mayor Tory whānau and past Mayor Celia Wade-Brown come down to the STV voting system in use for local body elections. That's despite the fact that the first round of voting in the last local body elections, whānau won more votes than the next 2 opponents combined and would have won under a first-past-the-post system. STV is a rank-based system where unused votes are reallocated based on voter preference and tends to deliver a much more representative outcome, leading to more diverse elected bodies with broader ranges of experience and skills. So it's no surprise that the right-wing media pundits don't really seem to be fans. And in a set of really coincidental coincidences, after a week of running attack pieces against Wellington City Council and Wellington Mayor Tory whānau, where right-wing commentators and public figures have been able to uncritically comment on everything, Stuff and the Post owner Sinead Boucher today announced that she will be part of a completely bipartisan group of totally not biased, civic-minded individuals, including some of the ones she platformed uncritically in her publications, called Vision for Wellington. For more information on this, see any of this last week's videos on how the media sets the public discourse into practice called agenda setting. The Ministry of Health has been forced to apologise to Associate Minister of Health Casey Costello, seen here in an actual interview she gave to Rupert Murdoch-owned Sky News in Australia, claiming woke is evil destroying our country, for not disclosing a conflict of interest with one of her staff members involved in Costello's tobacco law reforms. That conflict, the staff member is Labour's health spokesperson Aisha Varal's sister-in-law. While Deputy Prime Minister Winston Peters tried to use it as an opportunity to attack the Labour Party, Te Whatu Ora says the responsibility sits with them as the person involved has followed correct procedures declaring the conflict. Said Costello, well, sure, Nicola Willis's dad is an oil and mining magnate. Shane Jones seems to have regular dinners with fishery and mining groups on the fast track list. The Prime Minister owns several homes and changed the rules for the Bright Line test that he then profited off, and his sister-in-law works in the tobacco industry. Clearly, this is a deceitful action by the Labour Party and a terrible plot by the left to bring into question our actions, like the one that surrounds that mysterious tobacco-friendly smoke-free policy that just mysteriously showed up in my office, like a mystery. And finally, the makers of Wallace and Gromit have announced plans to team up with toy company Mattel to revive the internet's favourite penguin, Pingu. The new series will continue the stop-motion production style used in the original 1990s series, with Aardman Entertainment, who are best known for this type of work, continuing the adventures of South Pole-based Pingu and his sister Pinga. The series uses a made-up language for characters to communicate in called Penguinese, a somewhat coherent gibberish, with phrases like "noot noot," which should appeal to voter bases of both ACT and New Zealand First, who are somewhat fans of somewhat coherent gibberish. That is this week's news. Oh hey, thanks for making it all the way through the Omnibus edition this week. As you can see, it was another full-on week. It seems to happen all the time. Anyway, don't forget that like, share, subscribe stuff. If you want to become a member, you're more than welcome to. It's super easy. I think there's buttons on the page somewhere that say membership. I've tried to keep it as cheap as I possibly can because, yeah, I know what things are like at the moment. It's why I'm drinking instant coffee. Anyway, have you guys a fantastic week, and I will catch you later. Live long, prosper. Yeah, may the force be with you, all that kind of stuff. Here. The links to other things that come at the end of YouTube videos. Those ones there, here.